Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
I sent you out a selection, a small snippet from a book called The Devil and the Jews, all right, which in its heyday was a quite real blockbuster. I was just talking to Tybal about this whole issue. It's outdated in many ways. And so, but the material that I gave you is pretty much just a listing of incidents that this person, that the author of the book, Trachtenberg, that he was interested in dealing with the subject that we were talking about, or we're going to talk about. It's just a smidget to give you an idea. Subsequently, I've done some later research on what's available on the subject of the blood libel. And I can tell you that if you just read the Wikipedia article on it, it is very, very inclusive. And it brings you down to literally the 21st century, which is, and I printed out, I have here about 18 pages of the text that deals with blood libel references, whether they resulted in some action or not, from the beginning of the 19th century down till 2010. That's pretty recent. And you just by looking at this article, and the great thing about the article is, and this goes back to something else that we were talking about before, is that it has 132 footnotes, and that it has, for further reading, a list of books that have been written since after like 1998, and these books go down to 2022. One of the books that I just purchased today, excuse me. Hold on, I gotta get over here. There it is. So the book is called Blood Libel on the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth. Blood Libel on the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth. The author is Magda Teter, T-E-T-E-R, 2020. So this book is 4 years old. On Amazon, dozens of reviews. Get this one, 5 stars. That's very rare. And I didn't look at all the reviewers. That's popular ones, etc. But there is no question. And this woman, I looked her up. She is a big one. You never heard of her before. I never heard of her before. But she is a major scholar in early modern Jewish-Christian relations. Her dissertation was on the Polish church and its writings regarding the Jews in the early modern period. And she got her PhD from Columbia with distinction. And now she's a full professor at Fordham. Prior to that, she spent 15 years at Wesleyan. She's the president of the American Association for Jewish Research, the IHRA, of which I used to be on the board a million years ago. So, I mean, this is a big person. And the book is over 500 pages long. So, I haven't, is that going to be fresh reading for me at night? It'll probably be great because I'll read 3 pages and fall asleep, because it's not a dramatic book in a sense, solid research. But the point is, you see, and this is something to keep in mind when we get to this topic, that this is something that if you will, the half-life, to use nuclear terms, which I don't fully understand, but we all know that term, the half-life of the old-fashioned blood libels is still with us. And it's sad to know that, even among some very sophisticated populations. Sometimes it's innocent, the references to it. Sometimes it's very malicious. Well, we'll get into that a little bit more later, okay? But there's no question that the real the real tradition, so to speak, of the blood libel is a product of the Middle Ages. The real flow of this garbage began in the 12th century, and it took all kinds of different channels, different expressions, as we move down through into the early modern period. And that is something that is not a chidush. That's not a new discovery. I mean, even if you read the entirety of The Devil and the Jews, which is not just devoted, you understand, to blood libels. It's broader than that. But and as I say, certain aspects of the conclusions there have been challenged by subsequent reading of new sources and rereading of his sources. But the fact is what the stuff that you have had is just factual. Occasionally there's certain judgments he made, but it's factual. But it's interesting. That's only a small slice of the pie. That's the disturbing part of it. Okay, that's the disturbing part. Okay, but in the meantime, we have to go back on a couple other subjects we have to finish, because they are also shaping how subsequent generations viewed us. So we're going to go back to this discussion we began on the page that begins with Pope Innocent III, 1199, the Constitution for the Jews. And then the next item comes from the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Okay, and this deals with money lending. Okay, money lending. All right, so let me just quickly read through what we read before, and then we can pick up. So this is Jews and excessive usury. Okay, the more the Christian religion is restrained from usurious practices, so much the more does the perfidy, which means the deceitfulness of the Jews, grow in these matters. Right? So we are perfidious people, and our growth of, in other words, we have in the area of usury, the Jews are beginning to grow that whole field. So within a short time, they are exhausting the resources of Christians. Okay? I mean, it doesn't say that by lending money to Christians, in many instances, we're giving them the tools to actually increase their economic power, right? If you're going to borrow 100 whatevers to buy a new plow that has just been invented and just come on the market, so you can plow your field more efficiently and grow more whatever, right? Thank you, Mr. Jew, for providing me with the money to increase my economic status. But give me further, what shall we say, security in my farming. That's not mentioned here. What's alluded to here are the situations where, for whatever reason, the Christian, could not pay the loan. That's it. And so as a result, the Jews would go to the authorities. The authorities would say, pay the Jew. And that included interest, right? And that's how loans were made in the Middle Ages. Now, we talked a little bit about how when the Christians actually became involved much more in that later in that century, but primarily in the 13th century, they pushed the Jews out of business because they could offer more money at a higher rate of interest, by the way. Just keep that in mind. Okay, but of course this discussion doesn't deal with it because it's in fact, this is 1215 is still echoing the previous century. And the big bankers, the big Christian bankers were not into it at that point in time to the degree that the Jews had been proportionally. Okay, so wishing therefore to see that Christians are savagely oppressed by Jews in this matter, we ordain that by this synodal decree, that if Jews in the future, on any pretext, extort oppressive and excessive interest from Christians, then they are to be removed from contact with the Christians until they have made adequate satisfaction of the immoderate burden. Now, I mentioned to you that generally speaking, the Jews need governmental approval of their rates before they can do it. That was the norm. You signed a charter with whoever was your overlord and said you can rate. Yes, you're allowed to charge interest, but it should be blah, blah, blah. So it's not as if the Jews were inventing, numbers. And theoretically, the overlord could say that's too high, and they would be forced to bring it down. Okay? So they have to we have to make sure that doesn't happen, so they have to be punished by cessation of any financial relations with Christians. Christians, too, if need be, shall be compelled by an ecclesiastical censure without the possibility of an appeal to abstain from commerce with them. So it goes both ways. Both the Jew and the Christian are deemed to be guilty. We enjoin upon princes not to be hostile to Christians on this account, but to be zealous in restraining the Jews from so great oppression. We decree under the same penalty that Jews shall be compelled to make satisfaction to churches for tithes and offerings due the churches, which the churches were accustomed to receive from Christians for houses and other possessions before they passed by whatever title to the Jews, so that the churches may be preserved from loss. Okay? So they had to pay money to the churches to cover the loss in, shall we say, membership dues, making a bad analogy, that they would have been getting from the Christians. Okay? So this it depended upon the politics and economics of the local king, prince, whomever, the degree to which this would be carried out.
How long would that have lasted?
How
long would that, into what period of time would that have lasted?
You mean the loans?
No, the period of time in which the Jews, if they bought a house from a Christian, had to make tithes to the church.
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I don't know that.
Sounds outrageous.
No, by the way, the church did not have the power to implement that. I will say this just based upon a general understanding that I have of the period. The church did not push all the buttons, as I was about to say, right? The amount of time involved would be determined what the norm was, right? Because there were certain standards that had been operating, even in terms of Jews vis-a-vis the governmental authorities. There were certain guidelines that were being followed. So, whatever it might be. But if the Jew could make the case, do you really want me to reimburse the church for their tithes? You realize that means there's less money in circulation for me, less for you to borrow from me, talking to the Christian overlord. Remember, the Christians, the bosses, the overlords, the princes, kings, whatever title you want to give them, they benefited from this because they could then extract more money from the Jews by taxation, and that was in return for protection. And the fact is that for 150 years, roughly, from about the middle of the 11th century to 1200, by and large, the system worked to everybody's advantage, except to the disadvantage of the poor Christian bloke who could not make a success with the money that the Jew lent him. Now, that could be a result of things beyond his control, like drought or flood, right? That was a horrible thing. And, then it was, sorry, maybe the Jew would make we don't know the details. Did the Jews make accommodations? We don't know. But the system worked pretty well. A major shift, as I mentioned to you, is in the middle of from about 1220 to 1260 in France, the rise of Louis IX as king, who was an ardent Christian and a very strong anti-Semite, basically step by step, by making it harder and harder for Jews to run the system, push the Jews into poverty. Okay? to the result that in subsequent years, the beginning of the 14th century, because this king ruled for decades. All right, so you go a generation or two later on, the Jews are expelled from France. There are multiple reasons for that. One of the reasons is they were not a big source of money, because who stepped into the picture around 1240, 1250? The banks, the Catholic banks from Italy and southern France. They took over. The Jew became expendable. And at the same time, with all the craziness that we're going to talk about with blood libels, etc., the Jews became a liability. We mentioned that last time, yes? I don't know if you recall that, but the Jews became a liability for the kings because there was so much these little explosions in little towns and villages. You know, they didn't happen every year, but they happened. I mean, you got a sense of that from if you read, the book. Just there, the numbers that existed within decades or less than decades from each other in different locations. So this became a kind of an issue. Whereas prior to this time, the Jews were seen as a stabilizing factor, right? Because they had discipline on their people, and the church. I mean, the overlords didn't have to worry. They knew they would get their money. There was control. But once there's impoverization, there's a lack of control because there's nothing there. Cheryl.
I have a question about the Catholic banks from Italy and France. Did that mean they could now lend money to the king, to their princes?
Yes. In other words, these were not church run, but I mean, the people who ran them were Catholics. Yes. And what happened, this was already cooking in Italy and southern France, a generation or two before that you'll find these bankers who come out of the closet, so to speak, over the course of the 11th century, really. They began to find ways around the prohibition of lending money on interest to Christians. We mentioned that, right? The fact that you would say, well, I'm not taking interest. You know, the rationale, the legal rationale would be, I am simply getting the money that I would have had I had it in hand, that I could invest in something and earn with it. You're depriving me of that. Or they would say, they would make the date of the due date on the loan very short, okay? And then, so this is, let's say, a bank lending money to a Christian overlord in France in 1200. All right, so they give them, normally the loans would be, let's say, for 6 months. So the overlord had that time to pay it off. Well, but now, suddenly, these loans that are going out to these money-hungry overlords, so the bank is saying, oh, you got to pay us back in 3 months. Okay, I'll manage, knowing that was not going to happen. So what happens is then this is another rationale. After the 3 months and the overlord cannot repay the bank, what happens? A fee is imposed for non-payment. Is that not rational? Right? He violated the terms of the loan. And everybody in advance knew that that's what was going to happen.
That's interest.
So after 6 months, the guy would pay it off with the interest. And everybody was happy. All right, so these were, examples. I mean, the Jews, by the way, by the time we get to Poland in the 16th, 17th century, the Jews are doing something similar to that so that a Jew could lend money on interest to another Jew. We were behind on that one. Okay? And to this day, there is a document I made, the Heter Iska. There is a document, formal documents there are paradigms for that you can do. I believe if you were to contact, what's the Mizrahi Bank in Israel, which is Orthodox run, they run it like a bank. They pay interest. All right. If you're going to borrow money from them, if you invest with them, you get interest, right? Basically, you're giving them your money. They pay you back your money plus. Okay. like any other bank. An interest, right? You do a banknote, right? So you earn what, 2-3%? All right, you're earning interest. You can do the same with them. I'm Jewish, they're Jewish. How do they do that? They invoke one of these legal fictions that the Jews in Poland figured out in the mid-1500s. Nothing new under the sun. All right, anyhow, so all of this, but you get the sense, though, think about all of this you've just read. This is coming now from the popes, right? These are going to be the same popes, by the way, who will deny the legitimacy of the blood libels. Any book on blood libels will tell you that by and large the papacy denounced them. And in many instances, the royalty denounced them, okay? Because it was in some instances horrific. And these were the, so to speak, more enlightened people. And the church people understood the Jewish traditions on blood because they knew the Bible and they knew what it said. They didn't follow those things. But, you know it about blood. It's blech, all right, for Jews. So anyhow, the point is, though, the difference was, but the common denominator between the notion of the Jew as the money-sucking alien, as well as the blood-sucking, lies, it's populist. It comes from the bottom up. The scholars who analyze this will tell you that it was more so the priests and perhaps some of the local bishops that would push these things because it was to their advantage to keep, they didn't like the fact that the overlord was protecting the Jew, whether they did it for purposes of control and exercise of authority, or it's simply because of doctrinal notions about the Jew as the killer of Christ, right? And so forth. We'll see the various rationales why people said that the Jews could have done this. It's not just that, but that's part of it. Okay, so that's sort of what's going on. But the fact is, though, as you move out of this period, the stigma on the Jew as associated with corrupt money management to their advantage is transmitted. And these ideas are embedded into, look at Shakespeare, right? Classic example. Centuries later, right? He still has this image of the Jew. Okay, what's that? 16th century, England. There are no Jews around them. They were expelled in 1290. And the irony of it all is that a lot of this mythology of the Jew with respect to money and the Jew with respect to blood develops in the absence of Jews, because Jews were either killed but more likely expelled by the time these things really took hold, or they're on their way out. And it shows you how mythology can function in the absence of real life experiences. But this, of course, there were so many things. I mentioned this last time when you have there were well poisonings that were declared against the Jew in the 1320s. Then later on in the late 1340s, you had the plague. The Jews were responsible for that, even though we know that the Jews suffered as much as everybody else did from that stuff, because it had nothing to do with how clean you are. That myth of the Jews are clean people, so therefore they didn't suffer as much. No, that's not true. Okay, anyway, so all of this sort of came to a head. And so you get this mythology that exists. And as I said, we'll see, next time probably, how that carries out with the blood libels in the modern period. It's fascinating. I'll try to send you over some passages from that. I'll send you over the material from the modern period that I pulled out of Wikipedia. All right, as I say, the article is not too judgmental in the sense it's obvious that there's bad stuff going on, but they mention things that are even done innocently. It's not that today, in the modern period, reference to this can be done just, referring to an element of history without saying this is true. But there's no asterisk by saying next to it saying this is absolutely false. That's the problem. But it all feeds into this sustaining of the mythology. It's bad stuff. There's no question about it. I don't know if I mentioned to you about the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the 1970s. His name was General Brown. Does that name ring a bell? Did I mention that to you?
No.
I was on the faculty at the University of Judaism at the time, and I remember there was an email. I don't know if it was an email. It's too early for email, I guess. But there was an announcement that was made in public media that was picked up by the media that General Brown had said in some discussion, I think one of them was actually in a speech at Princeton University, that it's known that the Jews run the big banks of America. Okay, and this was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A president has to be very careful as to whom he selects as the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All right, and this guy was a bigot. In fact, he mentioned that twice in speeches. So it's not as if, he really believed it. He got a slap on the hand, by the way. You'd think that they would just totally kick him out and maybe pull his stars from him or something. I don't know what. No, slap on the hand. But there you go. I remember I did that because the librarian at the University of Judaism, this is in the old building on Sunset, some of you remember it, was getting phone calls left and right. Is it true? Is it true? Is it true? So I said, I was the historian on faculty, one of the historians on faculty. And I was the medieval guy. And since this all started in the Middle Ages, I told the librarian, if you have questions, send them to me. You can tell them, no, it's not true. Our history department tells us this is false. Just keep that in mind. I mean, the truth is I never got anybody calling me up on it. They must have just managed it at the library. But, they called the library because clearly the librarian would know if it's true or not. Not quite. Anyway, but the point is, there you had it. In the 1970s, Jews and money were still going strong, at least in certain circles. And, that's a long history, if you ask me. Okay, now, the next one. This is interesting because this seems actually the concept here. It's late coming in, right? This is 1215. Already in the Pact of Umar, which governed the definition of the status of the Jew and Christian and Zoroastrian in the Islamic empires, that was written sometime around 700 CE. Okay, we'll get to that, probably when we come back after Pesach, we'll deal with Islamic traditions regarding the Jew, anti-Semitic stuff. But the Pact of Umar already says that the Jews cannot dress exactly the same way that the Muslims do, as a sign of their subjugation. When we read it, you will see exactly. But it's interesting. Keep this in mind for when we get. You probably will forget it. I probably will forget it, but I'll write it down. And that is that the Jews, we do not have a copy of the Pact of Umar as it was written regarding Jews under Islam. But we do know from their own statements that this applied to the one we have was to the Eastern Church, the Byzantine Church. What governs their status vis-a-vis of the Jew in the Muslim Empire, and so basically scholars legitimately just pick that up and apply it to the Jews. Okay, so understand when we read that, keep that in mind. But it's okay. All I'm saying is that was a definition of what was called the dhimmi, the subjugated, tolerated minority under Islam. So that applied to Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. Okay, all right, Bob.
At Holocaust Museum LA, in the first room where we discussed life for Jews before the Shoah, we have a whole case of dolls that were created by one of the survivors that show how Jews had to dress in different times to separate themselves from the Christians. Yeah, we have there must be 9 or 10 dolls there dressed differently, and they show all the different ways that Jews were forced to dress.
Yes.
To distinguish them and limit them.
Yeah.
Like some of the women's sleeves didn't let the hands go out or things like that.
Yeah, right. Well, if you look at some of the cathedrals in medieval Europe, the Gothic cathedrals, which are essentially religious texts in pictures to a population that could not read. So there generally would be on the northern wall, all the glasswork is the Jew, the negative incidents depicting sinful Israel, whereas the southern, where the light was, the southern cathedral windows, the beauty and light of the Christian, or the incidents in the Bible that that deal with the future of Christians. But if you look at the Jews, there too you can actually see what they're wearing, because they were pretty detailed. And if you look at them, you can see there are different hats, particularly shapes of hats, different kinds of clothing. And yes, so we do have, it's interesting that we have these dolls. That's very good. Thank you, Bobby. But the other side of that is you can see it from the 12th century in these great cathedrals. I mean, I don't know if you've ever walked into the cathedrals, these giant cathedrals are absolutely amazing works of art, as problematic as it is, and science, because the whole structure is based on geometry. And this whole notion of the support on the sides of the church, of these tall walls, right? They needed support because the height was the thing now, not the width. Not that they were narrow, but relative to the height, though, they were narrow. And it's amazing how they actually did that. It was part of the science of the Middle Ages, legitimate geometry and physics. They knew where the pressure points were. They knew how to build things so that things stood up. Amazing stuff, but also problematic. I mean, the worst thing, we're not going to get to this, so I might as well mention it now. On the churches, in not all of them, but in many of them, and you can see this right on the front of Notre Dame. I stood there, I took pictures of it. I don't have them now. I mean, I was at a distance, so you probably couldn't make it out anyway. You have two women on either side of the main of the doors, at some point. Not in the middle are all the saints, but beyond that you have these two women. One of them is a woman standing tall with a crown holding a scepter, right? The other one is a woman bent over with the crown falling off her head and holding, not a scepter, a staff, holding a staff. Here the staff is broken. Beneath the woman standing tall with the crown, it says ecclesia. What does that mean? Church. Underneath the woman with the broken staff and the crown falling off, it says synagoga. All right, and this is in public view on the front of Notre Dame Cathedral, right where the Jews' books were burned in 1242. Jewish books were burned right in that plaza where some of us have stood. So anyhow, it's still there. It's there. And that I don't know what percentage of these churches have it, but it's not the only place where you can find it. But, that says something right there about the nature of Judaism that people see. Okay. All right. So here we have the notion of the Jews appearing in public. All right. I want somebody to read, please. Save my voice. Number 68 on page 3.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
A difference of dress distinguishes Jews or Saracens. What's a Saracen?
An Arab.
Oh, from Christians in some provinces, but in others a certain confusion is developed so that they are indistinguishable. Whence it sometimes happens that by mistake Christians join with Jewish or Saracen women, and Jews or Saracens with Christian women. In order that the offense of such a damnable mixing may not spread further under the excuse of a mistake of this kind, we decree that such persons of either sex in every Christian province and at all times are to be distinguished in public from other people by the character of their dress. Seeing, moreover, that this was enjoined upon them by Moses himself, as we read.
All right, what is that talking about, that last sentence?
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Where does Moses say that you have to be dressed in public differently than others?
Is it the tzitzis? But that's only for men. Only for men, though.
Yes, the third paragraph of the Shema. V'yasiftem lachem tzitzit al kanfei bigdehem. They shall wear a fringe on their corners of their garments.
That's men, not women. And this is saying men and women.
Right. They're expanding it. This is the church's interpretation of that. Yes.
Okay.
Right. Sure. But they can open up the Bible, and there it says, and the answer to that point could be, Barbara, well, the Bible doesn't always, they're always plurals refer to men because there's no neutral in Judaism.
Right.
The male expression was the dominant one, so they could easily say it applies to women also.
Okay, yeah, the same as B'nai would apply to men and women, children.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, why we have synagogues? There are many synagogues that encourage women to wear a tallis, at least when they go up to the Torah. Anyhow, but the point
such as Beth Am. Such as Beth Am.
Yes. Yeah, good for us. Okay. Anyway. So you can see here once again how the church, where it can, is using Jewish texts in the Hebrew Bible to justify something to tighten the screws on the Jews in their own time. All right, we've seen it before. It's not an uncommon phenomenon. Okay. All right, so there we see. So we have to dress differently. Again, to what degree was this carried out? Well, you can see from what Bobby showed us and what I told you about in the cathedrals. It must have been something that was actually acted on in different places at different times. I can't say that it was all done. It was always this way. But there's enough pictorial evidence, even from the beyond the wall, later on. If you look at pictures of Jews and Christians, you will see that in certain instances you can see a difference in garb between the two, be it a hat, a cloak, or something like that. They don't have a oh no, excuse me, time out. There was at different times a forerunner of the yellow star. The yellow Jewish star of the Nazis, okay? It was called Ruah, which means a circle. And there was a circle, a colored circle, that Jews were made to wear on the outside, of their garment, up here, at some point, a prominent point on their garment. The Jew...
One of our dolls, a couple of our dolls have that circle.
Yeah, that's right, and that was common. That was one way of doing it, rather than necessarily designing a hat or something else. And that does happen. Again, we don't know how common it was done. It's mentioned in certain papal decrees here and there, but there's enough information. We have pictorial information from the period or subsequently that indicates that this was enforced to a certain degree for the purposes mentioned, because they were afraid. One area, by the way, that we're not going to deal with here, but there was a whole notion about whether or not Jews could bring into their home paid housekeepers. It was not unusual for Jews to pay, this was not servants, to pay Christian women to come and clean the house. Some of them even stayed with them to the point where they could cook the food. In other words, they learned and they knew. So there were, when you have instances of popes or bishops or whomever that suddenly say, what are they doing? They're going to tear them away from us and make them convert to Judaism. That's what's behind here too, that we will somehow, draw these people. And the irony of the whole thing is that is the last thing that 99.9% of a Christian in the Middle Ages would want to do. I mean, even if the Jewish lifestyle looked nicer than the Christian lifestyle, which in many cases it did, but the point is, why would somebody want to become a Jew in an oppressed in a society that ultimately is in a situation of greater oppression than otherwise? And not that these people, remember, you're not really dealing with free societies here. These are not democratic states. But nobody could deny that, especially as time wore on and these public expressions in different places of animosity toward the Jew took hold. So there's no evidence anywhere. The people who converted to Judaism, which you can in Europe and prior to 1391 in Spain, okay? Prior to that time, you can count them on your hands. And most often, they are intellectuals who are driven by either philosophy, reading of texts, or mysticism into Jews who became Christians. The guys, for example, who took part in the disputations in France in 1240 and in Barcelona in 1263, the Talmud disputations, as they're called, were converts from Judaism, and they were intellectuals. And that was the case with a number of some of the very important church people who come out of the woodwork, shall we say, in the late 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. They are intellectuals, and they knew. All right, they understood, and they found ways. Now, granted, they had misgivings about their own Judaism for whatever the reasons. Maybe they just got tired of being subjugated, so they said, "I want to go over there." We don't know for sure, but they made it. They justified themselves by analyzing the text and by saying, "Well, this is so much more true than that," etc., etc. Some of them came out of a Talmudic background. Some of them knew Kabbalah, because the Zohar was floating around already, in written form by 1300. But the teaching of the Zohar, these ideas that were in the Zohar, had been going on since the middle of the century. So, these are the things that drove these intellectuals, if you will, into converting. But the masses of Christians, where do we find evidence of masses of Christians converting to Judaism in the Middle Ages? Ever. Never. The last time masses of people converted were when the Maccabees forced the Idumeans to convert to Judaism in what year? Hold on. About 135
2nd century BCE.
BCE. That's the Maccabees, right? Their clan, the Hasmonean dynasty. They were the ones who did that. Okay. That's the last I know. All right, AJ.
Just a quick comment. You mentioned a couple of things which turn around Donin, or Donin.
Yes, sure.
Who was 1240. He was the one who was the primary accuser during the disputation of 1240, and he was an apostate. And he was so for personal reasons that had to do with the way he was treated by the rabbis of his time. He would disagree with things, and they didn't like it, and they excommunicated him.
Yes.
So there's layers and layers upon these stories, but then he becomes used by the church, very useful, and has the disputation. It's argued by both sides as to who actually should have won the disputation, but within 2 years you had the burning of Jewish texts.
Right. Yes, exactly. So that's similar in Barcelona in 1263. They didn't burn books afterwards, okay, but there's no question.
Burn people.
rise in anti-Jewish public, attacks, shall we say, it wasn't a huge array like 1391. But after the Barcelona event, even though the king was a moderate, King James, Jaime James, who was the king of Catalonia and that whole tier of Spain and southern France, he himself came from southern France. Anyhow, so he was technically, you call, a moderate. And it's suggested that he had some sympathy for Nachmanides, for the Ramban, who was the rabbi who defended the Talmud in 1263. And basically, the impact of that on a formal change in Jewish status did not happen. But the overflow of that energy that spilled into the public caused a number of outbreaks. And this is well in advance of 1391. But the fact is, that was one factor along with others at that point in time that was generating anti-Jewish sentiment in Spain. In 1270, Nachmanides made Aliyah to Jerusalem, and he couldn't take it anymore. He always had, an urge to go to Israel. He was a great Kabbalist. He was Makubal. Now remember, the Zohar had not yet appeared, but these ideas were being studied. If you read his commentary on the Torah, you will see hidden in various statements that suggest a mystical interpretation. He doesn't go out. He'll say, well, this is the real meaning of it lies elsewhere, a hint, or sometimes even build in certain other statements that indicate that there is a mystical interpretation here. So this is the guy who ultimately fled, and he died in Israel subsequent. All right, Tybal.
Just back a little, it's not big numbers, but the time and the significance. The villagers of San Nicandro in Italy converted en masse to Judaism during World War II.
Okay, good for them.
That's the most modern I could think of. And then many of their descendants made Aliyah. Now, obviously, you can't do it during the war, but that's San Nicandro.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that somebody woke up to the truth. That's great. Good. Okay. So anyway, all right. So this is all part of a growing shift. I mean, when people analyze the anti-Jewish sentiment that developed over the course of the second part of the Middle Ages, you can't pinpoint a single moment. I would argue you cannot. It's a series of things falling into play all at the same time. And in terms of this whole notion of the positive role that the Jewish community could play in the Middle Ages in Europe, Western Europe, obviously. The Jewish population in Poland doesn't grow until after all these expulsions. But anyway, the positive role the Jews could play in the eyes of the overlords was a factor that allowed this subjugated tolerance to function. But once that notion of a positive role for them, for a variety of reasons, began to diminish, and their dependence on Jewish money as a source of financial support to their needs, personal needs, once that shifted, timed with the overflow of populist religion and ideas to one degree, which developed as a result of the Dominican and Franciscan monks who worked among the masses, and they were extremists and undoubtedly influenced bishops and priests at the local level, that you have a growth of this on a more local populist level. Okay? And the fact then, the financial issue, because of the competition from the Christian bankers in Italy and southern France, all of this is developing at the same time. And so you have to see this as it ultimately becomes a perfect storm. And that's what you begin to see toward the second half of the 13th into the 14th and 15th centuries. And to me, that's the best way to understand it. So it's not, this is the thing that did it. No, that's my opinion, my humble opinion. Okay. All right. Now, but going on, this is something else. Let's continue reading. Okay. Thank you, Barbara. Okay. Moses read. So they're right in the middle of the paragraph. They shall not appear in public. Somebody else, please read.
They shall not appear in public at all on the days of lamentation and on Passion Sunday, because some of them on such days, as we have heard, do not blush to parade in very ornate dress and are not afraid to mock Christians who are presenting a memorial of the most sacred passion and are displaying signs of grief.
Okay. Now this is interesting. This is, as we have heard, the attendees at the council don't annotate that. Okay, so we don't know where it came from, but I'll tell you something. This is around Easter time, right? Passion Sunday, and that, obviously is close to Pesach, and at this point in time, the blood libel of blood in the matzah had not yet emerged, as far as I can recall. So we can't talk about that. But what had happened, though, in certain instances, and there is evidence of this around this time, that a month before that is what Jewish holiday? Purim. And the Jews would celebrate Purim, but they would take an effigy of Haman and put him on a pole, and in order to support the image, it would end up being a cross. Now, we don't know, when you think about it, from a pragmatic point of view, and the notion of taking effigies and using them in public displays at this time was a big deal. Everybody did it. The Jews were not alone. That was part of the culture of the age. When you celebrate something, you can have, if it's good or bad or whatever, you have effigies. So the question is, were they mocking the crucifixion that was to happen a month later, right? And remember, you've got the 40 days, you have that period of time, in the Christian tradition when you can't eat meat, Lent, right? That's right in the middle of Lent. All right, so you already have this notion, you're looking up, you're moving right toward the big day. And Easter, theologically, is huge. And so now, 4 weeks before Easter, basically, the Jews are marching around with an effigy of Jesus on the cross. Okay, was that intentional? Or did it just happens to be? Because if you want to put an effigy up and make it look like a person, you can't have the shoulders going like that. You want to have the shoulders like this. And so, something like this, whatever. I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm not that old. But the point is, though, that it could have happened. And that type of thing, again, gets thrown around into the pot. And so this notion then of making light of, and this is pinned to the women, interestingly. That I find interesting, And it may be that the Jews are actually getting dressed for Pesach. We don't know what was going on. Could it be they intentionally got dressed to make fun of the lament, right? Because the serious lament is going on leading up to that, just as Easter ends on a positive note, because, of course, through the crucifixion, the Savior came into play, right? The Savior, dying for your sins. So that's what this is talking about. So it's hard to know what's the truth here, but that's what they were saying. Okay, continue reading, please, Tybal. What we most strictly.
What we most strictly forbid, however, is that they dare in any way to break out in derision of the Redeemer.
Aha. Right. They should not do anything that it does anything at all to speak negatively, to demonstrate any negative feeling toward the Redeemer, Jesus.
We order secular princes to restrain with condign punishment those who do so presume, lest they dare to blaspheme in any way him who was crucified for us, since we ought not to ignore insults against him who blotted out our wrongdoings.
All right, plain and simple. Condign means appropriate. I never heard that word until I read it here. Okay. All right, so there you go. Did the Jews have enough chutzpah to actually go out and mock Jesus? I don't know. Could this Haman thing have been a way of indirectly mocking Jesus? I don't know. Could the Haman thing been done simply to mock Haman? Don't know. Too much is unknown here. But the potential of such interpretation, given the fact that such images may have appeared, it's not out of the question. But clearly, this is intentionally picking up on these various things, and using it as a means of putting down the Jews. All right, and hence the whole notion then of different dress. Before we move on to the next one in public offices, you should know, if you don't know already, that in the pictures, some of the pictures you will actually find in Trachtenberg's book on the devil and the Jews, show pictures of demons and the devil himself. This is cartoons. And imprinted, we're now talking about 16th century, 17th century, because they appeared in printed texts. This is not manuscripts. The devils, the demons, are wearing a circle on their chest. Got it? The Jew symbol. And that's totally directed at the public who couldn't read. Okay? And that's something you got to keep in mind. That's what was going on. That's very powerful stuff. Well, again, the irony is, in most of those places, how many Jews were there? If we're talking 1600s. None. Or very, very few. Tiny amounts. There were some communities in southern France who they were allowed to come back in. Germany, of course, as we've said before, the removal of the Jews from Germany was done seriatim in different places, not all at once because it wasn't one country. France, we know what happened. England, we know what happened, and so forth. So, but they're now being printed and disseminated in books or popular type things that are flowing through the population. Visuals. That's powerful stuff. And they knew what the circle meant because before the expulsions, in many cases, they saw it. All right, so there you go. Now the final one, Jews not to hold public offices. So number 69, will somebody please read?
I'll read. Jews not to hold public offices. It would be too absurd for a blasphemer of Christ to exercise power over Christians. We therefore renew in this canon, on account of the boldness of the offenders, what the Council of Toledo providently decreed in this matter. We forbid Jews to be appointed to public offices, since under cover of them they are very hostile to Christians. If, however, anyone does commit such an office to them, let him, after an admonition, be curbed by the provincial council, which we order to be held annually, by means of an appropriate sanction.
All right, stop right there for a moment. So where could we consider examples of Jews who were in public offices? Any thoughts?
Or court physicians.
Court physicians, yes.
And that was probably the most common, but still would be considered public. I mean, most common in terms of a public position a Jew could get.
Correct. Another one.
What about like the poet or the court literary person? They had those people.
Yes, good. I was going to say that. Good, Barbara. Example, there were courts. I'm thinking Frederick II. Okay, the emperor of the what was it called? The Christian, the empire that wasn't Christian and wasn't an empire. Whatever. Okay, the Holy
Roman Empire. No.
Thank you, the Holy Roman Empire. Thank you. Yes, it wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, and wasn't an empire. But that's neither here nor there. But he controlled Germany and parts of Italy. He employed Jews to translate Arabic into Latin. Jews from Spain who knew Arabic were brought into the country, and that's how he was a literati himself, was Frederick, very much culturally oriented. And he wanted his theologians to have access to Aristotle and Plato and the sciences, right? The Jews helped translate medicine, astronomy, all these things from Arabic into Latin. And so that was a big deal for him. So it would appear, now this is, the date on this, 1215, precedes him. But it might indicate that already something like that had begun. And when we know that there was already translation of Arab Jewish, like for example, Maimonides, the god of the perplexed, was translated into Hebrew from Arabic in southern France while Rambam was still alive. So he died in 1204. So there was a Jewish family that was translating it for him. And it's interesting because he actually saw copies of their translations. Very unusual. And he has sent them, we have the letters. And so he says, this is great stuff. He really liked it. There was a later translation in about 1220 that took place elsewhere. I think it was in France also. That was done based on a Hebrew translation that was not as good, but that was the one that was more popular for whatever reason. So that was translated into Hebrew, and then the Jews in the courts, it was simpler for them. They just translated the Hebrew into Latin. So that version of Rambam circulated as well, and that's what Thomas Aquinas read. And now we're jumping down to the second half of the 13th century. But so the point is, yes, these literati, these Jewish intellectuals, were in court. Okay, so that's another way. Jews as bankers, were in certain instances. I mean, I can jump down later into the 15th century, where we know the Jews were in Spain, in particular, throughout this period, and they assumed a lot of different positions within the government: land management, finance, culture, all kinds of things. Much less so in the other parts of Europe. So it's possible that already by 1215 this was going on because the Reconquista was in its last stages, and they needed people to help manage things. So in Spain, it would be very likely that they had this in mind when they did this, because Jews were being brought in by the conquerors, the Christian conquerors of Spain, from the Muslims, because they could deal with the Islamic impact on all of Spain, because of the language issue. So that would be an example as well, definitely at this time. And so the whole point is this illegal, because if the Jew lives at court, what do? He can get the ear of the king and begin to shape royal policies that are to the detriment of the church. Okay, and this whole notion. Plus, it goes back to the idea that we already studied from Augustine and the other guy we studied. What are the Jews supposed to be vis-a-vis the Christians? What is their role in the big picture of the Jew in relationship to the Christian majority.
Subjugated?
Yes.
Lower.
Slaves. Servants. Right? We are to be, the church has basically taken over the role of Rome. Rome dominated the Jews. Now we dominate the Jews. And by the way, the Jews bought into that immediately because Rome, Edom in Hebrew, in rabbinic writings, initially was Rome. Then Edom was switched later on to mean Christendom. So the Jews were way ahead of them in understanding that, no, that's not true. It coincides sort of with the timing of Augustine. So remember, but that was the way they could be tolerated because they were the slave librarians, right? They were subjugated people who carried with them the original Bible, which could be opened up and reinterpreted properly by the Christians. But they would be the best people to go to validate the truth of the Hebrew Bible. All right? So, yes. So that concept already is in existence for centuries. And so this is a spin-off from that. Doesn't say that exactly, but you can understand. All right? Okay, so appropriate sanction. Cheryl, please continue.
Okay. And any official so appointed shall be denied commerce with Christians in business and in other matters until he has converted to the use of poor Christians in accordance with the directions of the diocesan bishop whatever he has obtained from Christians by reason of his office so acquired, and he shall surrender with shame the office which he irreverently assumed. We extend the same thing to pagans.
Okay. So they have to return any benefit that they got from their position, right? And surrender the office. Okay. So here again, this is 1215. So this depends upon the degree to which the king wants to follow the teachings of the church. But over time, you can see this is something that was going to move in this direction. All right. Spain, obviously, is the last country to really, where this would apply, because the fact of the matter is that you had, I mentioned to you Abravanel and the chief rabbi of Spain. Did we talk about him later? What happened before the expulsion? Does that ring a bell? Tybal, did I talk about it?
I think so.
Did anybody remember what I said? Don Yitzchak Abravanel and Abraham Senor, who was the chief rabbi, were living, the date is 1490. Remember what happened? I will tell you. Okay. They lent 10 million of the Spanish currency
to
the king. Alone, $10 million or whatever. All right? 10 million. Maravedis. The Maravedi was the money. 10 million. That's a big number. These guys were very wealthy. Okay. The money was used to complete the expulsion of Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. It funded the army that in 1491 took over Andalusia, or as the Muslims still call it, Al-Andalus. And that was it. The Muslims were gone. That having happened, in 1492, for a variety of reasons which we will not go into at this point, Ferdinand and Isabella decided it was time to get rid of the Jews. One of the reasons was given because since they were still around, that they were influencing conversos to revert back to their Judaism. The fact is, this is probably highly exaggerated because those who would be doing so in secret had done so for decades before that. And secondarily, Christians who sought to improve their position and would never do that. Okay, and there were conversos who were not accepted neither by the Jews nor by the Christians. So it wasn't that cut and dry, but it's a good thing to hang it on. Because we represented a threat. But there are deeper reasons in terms of populist movement feelings, attitudes of the people around them, and their own sense of, perhaps especially on Isabella's part, not living up to the standards of Christianity in dealing with the Jews, and having allowed the Jews to have too much power. So for these reasons, they were to be expelled. So what happened to Don Yitzchak Abravanel? And these guys were influential at court, obviously. They were big money lenders, right? So what happened to Abravanel? He goes to Italy. He left with everybody else, all his money behind. Now, he was able to eke out a living in Italy because he was a great scholar, brilliant mind, and had, leadership capacities. So he was okay, but hardly as rich as what he was. And what happened with Rabbi Harav Abraham Senor? Remember anybody? Well, he became a Catholic. The chief rabbi of Spain converted to Catholicism, which tells you something about the meaning of being chief rabbi. It was not necessarily a profound theological practice here. It was politics, right? But that was his title. So he became, and he stayed. I don't know. I don't think there's any real record of what he did afterwards, but there's no indication that he suffered. He was definitely connected in high places. And I'm sure that the king and the queen were thrilled that the rabbi became a Catholic. So they're going to probably, watch out for him. So that's what happened. Okay. But again, that sort of is the culmination of this edict to kick Jews out of all kinds of positions in the court. Okay. So there you have it. All right. Let's see, where are we? Oh, it's time to stop. So next time, what we're going to do, next time is our last lesson. I'll send a message around. We will continue. We will read the material from Thomas Aquinas and then talk about the blood libels and get a sort of a broad picture of how that developed. And if there's, it's possible that we could carry that over later on, but we'll see, because we only have another hour and a half. But we'll see what happens with that. We will meet at some point. We will continue second semester. Okay, remember, I'm an old university professor. The second semester will begin sometime after Pesach and carry us through the end of June. And hopefully by that time, we can finish this curriculum. And those who study with me the book of Amos, we will be able to finish the book of Amos. And then we will say, we've studied a lot this year. Okay, that's the whole point. So there will be appropriate announcements, hopefully correctly presented vis-a-vis logging in and dates, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. All right. So, my friends, I wish we'll see you next week. I wish you Shabbat Shalom. And if you get a chance to read over the material, again, from Trachtenberg's material that I sent you, please do so. And once again, I'd love to recommend to you this book by Magda Teeter, T-E-T-R. The first two words, it's blood libel is the first two words in the title. If you go online, you can buy it for Kindle, you can buy a hard copy. And the book has received raves. This woman is recognized. I never heard of her before. I'm out because I've been out of the loop. But this woman has done great work. And also, if you go online on Wikipedia, type in blood libel, go to Wikipedia, and you can. That's a long article. Gives you a good summary. But if you look again at the references after the footnotes, you will see that a lot of the research on this, not just her book, a lot of research has been done in the last 2 decades about blood libels. It suddenly became very popular. And if you look at the universities that are publishing these books, they're not fly-by-night university. And the journals in which some of these articles appear are serious articles. This is serious scholarship. And it's disturbing. Okay, final point. Bobby, sometimes my professors used to say, don't raise your hand when the students are eager to go to lunch. But go ahead, I'll take you anyway.
We didn't have class last week, right?
We do.
Yeah, it's online.
Oh, we had classes? Oh, is that when you discussed Deborah's talk?
What?
Is that when you discussed Professor Lipsat's talk?
No.
Wait, I thought we skipped last week because you were supposed to be in Arizona.
Yeah.
I had COVID. That's why
we didn't have class.
We didn't have class last week. No.
So I thought we were going to discuss Professor Lipsat's talk today.
No. We can talk. No. That's contemporary stuff.
Oh, okay. I thought you said you wanted us to listen to it, so we would discuss it.
No, I wanted you to listen to it because it came out. That's all.
Oh, okay.
That's for your personal edification.
Oh, I thought it was for discussion.
Oh, no.
Okay.
That's okay. Yeah. No, that's something we will ultimately turn to at the end of the course because that deals with contemporary stuff, and we will talk about that. Yes, our last sessions. We may not unearth anything you did not know. But you've got to the interesting thing is to see. That's why, this article in Wikipedia, just to get a sense, he's drawing, the author of the article, whomever it was, is drawing from the references that you will see. And as I mentioned, it's wonderfully annotated, and you get a sense of how this has crept up into the 21st century. Okay, and I only looked. I mentioned to you the segment because that I cut out because if we have time, I will focus on the blood libel as it manifested itself in modernity. Now, if we don't, we'll carry that down. But you can get the basic stuff if you want to look at that. If you read the material I gave you. From Trash, and then you read in the article on Wikipedia from 1840 on. Okay, it printed out with 12-point font. I did that here. I have 18 pages, so it's manageable, but it's a lot. So anyway, if you can do that, you'll get a sense of where we stand today with respect to blood libels and things like that. And it'll blow your mind. It's unbelievable.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.